Along those lines, I want to talk about maybe just very quickly, and you do a great job of this in the book, just talking about the origins of public school. Where did this come
Mm.
from? And because I think a lot of us are kind of addicted to traditional government school, and we've kind of think that that's because most of us, yeah, I came up in traditional government school. Obviously, the majority of us have. And I think that that's where we kind of get stuck in this model of education has to happen from Labor Day to Memorial Day, Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 3:30, and that education can't happen any other way. So talk about the origins of public school. Why did our society kind of adopt this model and, kind of push everything else aside? Where did that come from?
Right. I trace in the book the history of compulsory education and compulsory schooling. I think it's interesting. Most of us think schooling, and particularly compulsory schooling, has been around forever. And really, it's a relatively recent societal phenomenon. So in the book, I go actually all the way back to 1620 when the Pilgrims arrived in what was then became Massachusetts Bay Colony. And just a couple of decades later in the 1640s, the Pilgrims launched the first compulsory education laws in the colonies that called for a state interest in educated citizenry, again, keeping parents as the ones primarily responsible for ensuring that their children are educated, but also compelling cities and towns of a certain size to offer educational resources, schooling resources. So for certain smaller towns, their obligation from the state was to hire a teacher for any parents that wanted to utilize that teacher's resources. And for towns or cities of a larger size, about 100 families or more, that those towns were required to open and operate and fund a grammar school, again, for any families that wanted to participate in that kind of learning. So there was the compulsion in the colonial era was really on municipalities to offer educational resources. The compulsion was not on parents to take advantage of those resources, and indeed many parents didn't. Homeschooling was, of course, the default, the expectation in colonial America. You had these kind of diversity of education options for young children. You had what were called dame schools, which were these kind of nursery schools in your neighbor's kitchen, where young children might learn, their letters and their numbers and give their mom a break so she could get some other work done around the house. And those were widespread throughout the colonies. You had tutoring and taking advantage of various tutors who would come to your house. You had an assortment of private schools, public schools, charity schools, church schools, and of course apprenticeships were widespread throughout the colonial era. Really, this expectation that young people would learn by being immersed in their trade or in their field from a young age. This all changes in the mid-19th century in the US when Massachusetts, again leading the way in compulsory learning, passes the nation's first Compulsory Schooling Act in 1852. And for the first time, this compelled parents to send their children to school under a legal threat of force. The initial compulsory schooling law required children ages 8 to 14 to attend school 12 weeks a year, of which 6 of those weeks needed to be consecutive. So it was really not anything like the childhood behemoth that schooling has become now, really absorbing so much of childhood and adolescence from very young ages all the way up to later teen years. And we've seen compulsory schooling statutes really expand in the last several decades, now going even younger to 4-year-olds, and especially with the onset of pre-K programs and universal preschool, this expectation of compulsory schooling statutes going to ever younger ages all the way up to age 18. So again, compulsory schooling really taking up quite a bit of childhood and adolescence in recent years, something that's really, again, really something only over the past 150 or so years that's really taken root.
One of the critics of homeschooling and unschooling, and this kind of moving away from public school is a lot of people say that there's a lack of diversity and that, people are kind of trying to get away from anyone that's different than them. We're just trying to indoctrinate our children. And you do a great job in the book. You talk a lot about families who have, strong ethnic backgrounds who are actually homeschooling in order to preserve their cultural and ethnic heritage. Would you just quickly touch on the diversity within homeschoolers and how that's even changing, because of COVID? But just talk about, the diverse population of homeschoolers and how homeschooling can actually embrace diversity in a way that's different and more authentic than public school does.
Right, right. Well, I mean, the homeschooling population, again, pre-pandemic, was really increasingly reflective of the American population as a whole in terms of its geographic, demographic, ideological diversity. The New York Times even acknowledging in an article a couple of weeks ago when they were talking about the growing ranks of homeschoolers or interest in homeschooling now because of the pandemic, even made the point to point out that homeschoolers pre-pandemic were less affluent on average than the typical American population. In my book and my articles, I talk about some of the demographic diversity. You see, for example, 25%, Hispanic families represent 25% of homeschooling families, which is about equal to their population in the overall K-12 school age population. So mirroring again the larger diversity of our current population. African Americans as well, their numbers doubled in the homeschool population between 2008 and 2012 to just under 10% of the overall homeschool population. And you're right that The Atlantic has done a series of articles in particular on why so many African American families are exiting the public school system and choosing homeschooling. And a lot of it is to escape what they see as a culture of low expectations for children of color and institutional racism.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point to make because I hear a lot of people talking about, well, homeschooling is only for rich people or it's only, the Christians. And, and I've read some other things that talk about, in the 80s and all where it was a lot of, Christian folks were kind of pulling their kids out because they felt that the public school was kind of leaning away from that. But the modern homeschoolers, it makes up a broad range of non-religious folks and folks of all different religious backgrounds. So it's not just the Christians, trying to indoctrinate their kids.
Yeah, it's if I can just add to that too, Rebecca.
Sure.
It's again, the Atlantic reporting, and there's other data to suggest this as well, that about 2/3 of today's homeschoolers would identify as Christian, which is equivalent to the American population as a whole. According to Pew Research, about 2/3 of Americans identify as Christian. So again, the homeschool population just reflecting the overall U.S. distribution of the population. But even if the majority of today's homeschoolers would identify as Christian, religion is not the primary motivator. The most recent federal data on homeschooling show that the number one motivator for today's homeschooling families is concern about the environment of other schools, including safety, drugs, and negative peer pressure. So, again, even if you have families who might have a deep religious tradition, it is not the top motivator. In fact, I believe it was something like less than 15% of families said that religion was their primary reason for homeschooling, again, according to federal data. So really just a rejection, I think, of trends we're seeing in conventional schooling in particular. This increased focus over the past couple of decades on really standardized education, test-driven education. Some of the most growth in the homeschooling population has occurred in urban secular communities, in particular among families who are really disillusioned by a lot of the kind of remnants of Common Core and this kind of test-based standardized approach to learning.
Yeah, and those of you who may not be aware, Kerry participated in a debate with Professor Bartlett of Harvard University, and it was, talking about this presumptive ban on homeschool that she'd like to have. And one of her critiques was that she felt homeschoolers were not being exposed to a wide array of ideological backgrounds. And someone wrote in and asked her the question, well, do you feel that students who are in public school, should they be
Mm.
forced to attend, maybe a political rally or a religious service, of something that is different from their background? And I think that question really took her aback. And she said, well, that's up to the parents if they want to expose how they want to expose their children politically and religiously. And so I thought that her response was just, spot on.
Well, and the
So
research just, excuse me, the research just doesn't back her up either. I mean, Daniel Hamlin is a professor at the University of Oklahoma, recently published an article looking at cultural capital among school-age children. And he found that homeschool children had far more of what he defines as cultural capital, this kind of connection to community and exposure to different cultural events and people in the community and different ideas and viewpoints. He found that homeschoolers were much more likely than their public school peers, for example, to visit libraries regularly, to visit museums, to attend cultural events, to go to bookstores and zoos. I think that that's right, because, while the stereotype of homeschoolers might be that they're kind of separated from the community, the reality is that it's the opposite, that they're much more immersed and engaged in their communities, really becoming connected with those people, places, and things around us, having authentic socialization with, communicating regularly with the people in our communities. Much higher rates of cultural capital. Similar research also shows that homeschoolers have more political tolerance even than schooled children, that they have a greater appreciation for diversity of political viewpoints and ideas.
yeah, and that's a great point, that that homeschoolers have that opportunity to be out there in the community, meeting people of different backgrounds and different ages, who live in different zip codes.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I think that's something that the critics sometimes don't always look at.